Barbara, I am so pleased to welcome you today to the Ingenious You community.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here with you.
Our listeners are always very interested in knowing something about the leadership journey of our guests. In your case, your career spans higher education, libraries, business, entrepreneurship, nonprofit organizations, and more. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and the influences, the forces that have shaped you into the leader you are today?
Well, I have done a number of things, and actually, that's been the kind of the excitement for me about my career is the diversity of it. And I would say, I think I'm just curious. And so, if something seems really appealing to me, I'm not so rigid about that. You know, you have to do this in order to do that. Kind of, I think we were told that you have like a ladder that you've got to follow. And I believe much more in that kind of circuitous route. So, I grew up in a family. My dad was served in both World War II and in the Korean War, and very entrepreneurial family business. So I think that might have been what led me into entrepreneurship, and that took me on a path to owning my own business. It took me on a path to leading an entrepreneurship center at Seton Hill University, and that was really my foray into the academic world. And I have to tell you, when I first got there, it was really hard because I had just come off running my own transportation company, and I had 600 vehicles on the road every day, and if they all went out and they all came back and nothing happened that day, it was a really good day. So here I am, in an entrepreneurship center with students who are on a 4-year track or they're in a master's program. The feedback is so much different in academia. That was the hardest thing for me to get used to, was that feedback loop. Now, I mean, I've been so fortunate in my career that students have kept in touch. I know what students have done over time, but you only find out so much later. So I found that really required a lot more internal motivation and internal direction. And I think it did change the path of so then I spent some time at Carnegie Mellon University. I was so fortunate to be there. I worked both in the School of Public Policy and Management, as well as in the School of Design, which it was fantastic to look at problems from multiple different angles. That's what I enjoy the most. It's what I think I'm really good at is looking at a problem and seeing an end, and then figuring out a way to get to that end, and that's usually the more difficult part of the problem. And I was able to do that both at the Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh, which was just such a iconic institution, and such a it was just my tremendous honor and privilege to get a better understanding of public service in that realm. And, and I think that's in part what led me to where I am today at NAICU. I think part of what I do is public service, and part of what I do is grounded in higher education, and in particular in independent higher education. So as you know, I went from the Carnegie Library to being president at Wilson College in South Central Pennsylvania, and then here to NAICU.
Well, it sounds like you've come full circle in terms of how those threads all are woven across your career. So I want to dive in a little bit deeper to talk about your leadership style, which you have begun to segue into as you describe your own way of thinking about things. But how would somebody describe you as a leader? So how do you show up in an organizational context in terms of your leadership? And do you have a leadership superpower? Everyone has one of one kind or another. So I'm curious your thoughts about your own superpower.
That's a great question. Well, in terms of my leadership style, I really believe that you are most effective if you have a great team around you, and being able to collaborate and being open to different perspectives. That's really, I think, perhaps my superpower is that I am very curious, as I said earlier, but I'm curious about how problems get solved in different contexts. So, one of the things that I like to do every year is to go to an event that I've perhaps or a conference that I've never been to before that might not even be in my industry or segment because people are everywhere, people are solving problems, and everywhere people are trying to bring teams together to solve problems. And that is, it's universal. And so looking at how other people do that really helps me keep learning. I think that that's one of the things that is so engaging to me about higher education is that you're learning, you're living in higher education because every day you're teaching somebody something new, you're learning something new, and that learning really energizes me. It keeps me from being discouraged with big, hairy, complicated problems, which I've had several of in the last several years, the last many years. I think that's extraordinarily important. And then, as far as the leadership style, it's really about embracing transparency. I think that is incredibly important. I think I learned that at the library. You cannot be in the midst of public service and serving such a broad community without being really upfront with everyone and being upfront if you have a problem and being upfront about the solution for the problem, even if it's what folks are uncomfortable hearing. So, I do think that there's an overall challenge, particularly it's not just higher education. It was true in the library world as well, where there's kind of a legacy to what the work that we do. And if you rely on that legacy alone, it's hard to be successful because the world around you is changing dramatically. So, I think embracing transparency is incredibly important. Surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than you are. There are certain things I know and that I do well. And I think it's really important to play to your own strengths. So you have to know your own strengths. But it's very important to have people around you that can help make things happen. We don't make things happen on our own. And I think that's really important to know that. And, I think just in terms of if there's a superpower out there that I have, it really is looking at a problem and being able to see the end of it. Someone in my office said to me, it's like being a Lego master builder. So if I were to come into, and I've done this now, I was with my grandchildren this summer and we walked into Legoland and they had this big mound of blocks. I'm baffled by that. I cannot put all those together. So that would definitely not be my superpower. But but on the other side, that is kind of what I am good at, is looking at a problem and not all those blocks, but looking at a problem and being able to see what the end of that is, what the end of that would look like, and then figuring out how to get there. And I'm not discouraged if I hit a dead end along the way. If something's not working, I can come back and then move forward. And I think that level of flexibility is extraordinarily important.
Indeed. Now you have a DBA, Doctor of Business
Yep.
Administration, as your highest terminal degree. It's a little bit unusual. I don't run into very many college presidents, university presidents who have the DBA as their terminal degree. I'm just curious what that has given you in terms of an edge or maybe a different perspective on leadership in higher education.
Well, all of my degrees are in business. It doesn't feel unusual to me, but I do think it does give me this kind of an orientation that is grounded in business philosophies. And I used to feel, coming out of my experience in both the business world and as an entrepreneur, and then in the various exploration of both a master's degree and a doctorate, I felt very grounded in all that business world and felt that if I stepped into the nonprofit world, it would be similar. I really felt that it was going to have this a similar kind of structure financially, that you had to be successful The line, no money,
Mhm.
no mission, right? So we know that in higher ed, it's 100% true. If you don't have a good bottom line, then it limits what you can do for students, for your community, for your faculty, staff, et cetera. So, I thought that there were going to be tremendous similarities, but really it is very different when you're in particularly public service, because the world is so big. You're serving so many people, and that just makes for a tremendous difference. I mean, it gives you this deep sense of responsibility toward people, in particular public service does. And I think that higher education does that too, because that's what we're focused on. That's the outcome for us. That's the reward for us, is in seeing students be successful and seeing students graduate. And so that is different than the corporate world, the business world, where it is all about return, that financial return. We really get this return from people. And that, I think so many of us today are looking for meaning in our work. We feel that if we can't find that meaning in our work, that we aren't connected to growth, or that we're not connected to belonging. So I think that, if we understand the meaning of our work, it can keep us grounded in the difficult moments that we experience.
Sure. Although I can imagine with the business background, the kinds of challenges that so many of our colleges and universities are facing today, that background is incredibly valuable, because the meaning is very important, and we need to make sure our institutions exist and thrive at the same time. And I know you did exactly that at Wilson, which we're going to come back to in just a second. After your transformative, and I would call it transformative, presidency at Wilson College, you made the decision to transition to leading NAICU, which is an organization that represents independent colleges and universities nationwide, as you've already mentioned. I'm wondering what motivated that shift, and have you had to adapt your leadership in any way in this new role?
Every opportunity I've had in my career has just it's made me a better leader. It's made me a better person. It's taught me all sorts of new skills and new ways to look at problems in particular. And when I was given the opportunity to come and meet with the NAICU folks, and it's a whole story. I won't tell you that whole story, but it was, I thought it was just a tremendous privilege to think not just about being the leader of a campus community, but being engaged in public policy across an entire sector. And I do think it's the experiences that you have along the way that prepare you for those things. So when I was at Carnegie Mellon, I was in the School of Public Policy and Management. And so, looking at, I think the problems that we're having on a public policy perspective really can make a difference across our sector. And so this was just an opportunity to really look at some of these challenges, but on a much bigger scale, and to be able to have an impact that would make a difference for all of our students and for all of our institutions. And that's what motivates me every day. I really, really believe in the diversity of our ecosystem, our higher ed ecosystem. I think that we are better for having both public institutions, private institutions, specialty colleges, art and design, historical Black colleges and universities, music conservatories. All of these things are part of the richness of our higher ed system. And I think it would be a tremendous loss were we to go to one monolithic public system. And so, the opportunity to, champion our current ecosystem and the tremendous value and richness that's in that for communities, for our students, for our nation, in terms of how we create a workforce for the future. I think all of that is so important that, I was just excited by the challenge. And it is different. In many ways, it's kind of like this experience I had when I first went into higher education at the Entrepreneurship Center at Seton Hill. The feedback, how you judge your success, how you know that you're making a difference, is much harder to determine when you're looking across the national footprint. But I can see progress that we've made and a difference that we've made. Sometimes the interesting thing is in this role is sometimes it's what you make help happen, the success that you have with particular initiatives, but sometimes it's also what you help make not happen. And right now there's some bad ideas out there, and making sure that those ideas don't get air and oxygen and that they don't grow and get passed in bills and then be implemented. That's a different measurement for the work that you do and for finding meaning in the work that you do. So yeah,
That's a really important thing to talk about. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody frame leadership in quite that way. And boy, in the times in which we live, that is so very important. So good for you. We could probably have a whole nother podcast just on the things you are going to make sure do not happen under your watch. So as you know, season 6 of the podcast is focusing entirely on women in leadership. And I would love to know, as a woman who has navigated leadership in such wide-ranging types of organizations, what kind of unique challenges you have faced, if you're willing to share one or two in particular, and how you addressed them.
I think that there are distinct differences between the way that women manage and the way that men manage, the way that women navigate both their personal life and their work life. And they are, I do think for women that your personal life and your work life are very intertwined. They're mixed together. And, I grew up, my generation, we were very much on a track where we could compete, and we're going to work just as hard as men worked and be successful just like they were successful. And I think what we missed along the way is that our leadership styles are very different. And it is wonderful to be more collaborative and inclusive. It's not a negative, it's a positive. And I think we have to find ways to be comfortable with those differences and not to put them in the background, but to put them in the foreground. I've certainly had the experiences, and what's baffling to me is that I still have these experiences where I can walk into the room and be either the only woman or one of just a few women. And I think that that's a dynamic that I had expected would have changed by now. I served for a while on a commission, a workforce commission, and every time and it was, my kids were school age at the time, and getting everybody off to school and getting to these meetings, which would always be at like 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, some of them even earlier than that. And I would just like barely slide into that room. If I had gotten everybody, you always could have felt like your day was over by the time you got everybody to school on time, and that was successful. But then getting yourself in the room, and the gentleman who was running the commission, because I was the only female on the commission, he would say, "Good morning, gentlemen, and Ms. Mistick," and he would specifically call me out each time, which is, I know that it was being done from a perspective of recognition and kindness. I have had no indication that it was otherwise than that, but it does put a spotlight on you each time. And then it makes you feel more responsible, not just for the work that you're doing collectively as a group, but also for other women. And I think that's a burden in some ways for women to deal with, because you feel like if I don't contribute adequately, or if I'm not showing up all the time, then the next time we might not have any women on this particular commission. And so, I do see today that people push back much more about this, and perhaps even might have corrected him in the way that he addressed the group. I just, that wasn't the norm for me, and as I was on this career journey. So I think that today, one of the things I think is so important for women is to feel comfortable stretching into new positions. The research, the literature out there says men are more than happy to stretch into a position, even if they just know half of what you need to know to be successful. But women want to know 100% of it before they will accept a position. And I think, what I have seen is that you can learn on the job, and it's okay. And I have part of what excites me and part of what I'm curious about are the things that I don't know. But I don't think that's true for all women. And I think it's something that, we all have to be aware of, is that, you can do something every day that scares you a little bit, and you can learn from that, and you can be a better leader from that as well.
That is great wisdom. And I'm sure that I would imagine you have had an opportunity to advise, mentor many other women along the way. And that's undoubtedly something so let me change gears here a little bit. I want to talk more about your time at Wilson College, which, as I mentioned, was an incredible tenure, marked by several bold initiatives, things like the Wilson Today plan, tuition restructuring, the student debt buyback program, among others. Is there one achievement you're particularly proud of in terms of all of the things that you accomplished, and any lessons that you took away from your tenure, your time there?
Yes, the whole experience at Wilson College was just tremendous for me, but it was also very difficult as well. Change is very hard for institutions. That's probably an understatement. It's just one line, but there's so much meaning behind that. And what was clear to me, and the reason I was excited to go there, was that it was clear to me in meeting with them and in the whole search process and the interviewing process, is that they did want to change. But wanting to change and the reality of change are two entirely different things. And I think that one of the things that was reinforced for me there, and it's something that I have seen over and over again, is that it's important to be nimble and not to chase perfection. I think often when you're looking at change in particular, the thought of where you're going is frightening to people, and it's scary, in fact. And so in order to hold back that that future, or to hold back what you're nervous about, the change, that would be more accurate, to hold back that piece, you want to keep doing one more thing. Maybe let's check on this, let's try this strategy again, let's do one more analysis paralysis, let's do one more analysis. So chasing perfection really can hold you back from being where you need to be. And if you spend too much time chasing perfection, an institution can end up closing, or end up being in a much weaker fiscal position over time. And that is something that I see as a significant challenge for higher education, is that we are slow to change. We're just slow to change. And if not everyone, certainly there are institutions doing, and I talk to somebody every day who's doing something entrepreneurial and exciting, and it's wonderful. But if we want to try to get to that 100% confidence level, or 100% agreement across our communities, then things are not going to happen. And certainly we had those challenges at Wilson, and as in the change process, and dealing with the sense of loss that people had as change occurred at the institution became a big part of my job. And it was something that I hadn't anticipated. I didn't understand that there would be so much. I think it's just a sense of this tremendous sense of loss, this almost grief that the community experiences. So legacy is extraordinarily strong. I think you can't underestimate the role of that in shaping a community and creating a culture. And when you look at change, really, it's complicated to get there because of all of that. So the last thing I'd say is that I think the thing that I'm most pleased about collectively is the enrollment growth, because that's what really creates a healthy institution. So 100%, that's what I'm excited about. That's the outcome that I'm excited about. But the getting there, the piece that was so excited about getting there was really the loan buyback initiative, because we were the first in the nation to do it. And it was, it was innovative and creative, and it was an opportunity for me as president to talk to students about financial literacy. And and this is, I know you're going to connect this to my business background, and that's totally fair. And I would agree with you. But the financial literacy piece of it, was exciting to me, because I wanted students to be able to reach their dreams, but not to be burdened by debt after that. And I do believe that if we can help our communities understand student debt and understand what they're stepping into, then I think we create alums that are going to be more loyal to our institutions. If you leave and later on you've got all this debt to pay back, it can't help but make you look back on that experience in a different way. That's the part I was most excited about. I was excited that our community was willing to embrace that. I know the pieces of the change that created the most stress for the rest of the community were the transition from being a women's college, a single gender institution, to being a coeducational institution. That was what was most stressful for the institution. But that just shows you that each one of us are looking at things with a different lens. And it's that collective lens that creates the change. I really firmly believe that it wasn't one thing, and it was certainly not, in my estimation, the transition to coeducation that created the enrollment changes. It was the programs, it was the overall strategic plan, it was some of these value initiatives that we're talking about. It was all of that together. I think today institutions are so complex that it's usually there's not a silver bullet solution for institutions, and we have to be willing to look at that collectively. And it's a little harder, it's messier, but in all of that noise and that mess, it does give you an opportunity to bring people along. I think that is, that's very satisfying, as well as to see people accept the change and be excited by the change over time.
Yeah, you're reminding me of an interview I did last year with Dr. Andrew Sue, who's the longtime president at the College of Charleston. And he's an engineer by background. And he said, quite emphatically, too many presidents think that there is just this one thing that you have to focus on and get right. And if you get that one thing right, then everything's going to go as planned. And he said, in my experience, there are lots of things. You never quite know what's going to be the thing that works, but in the synergy between all of the things you're trying to do, oftentimes that's where success comes. And you don't always know when you're setting out to do all these things. And your experience at Wilson sounds like a living case study for what he was talking about.
No, absolutely. I don't think there's just one thing today, because if you've got an institution that's 100 years old, 150 years old, we've layered things on over time, and other generations have changed too. Maybe the changes weren't as significant and dramatic as the things that we're seeing today, but you have to be able to look at an institution comprehensively, and to find the kind of health for institutions, to have institutions be not just surviving, but be thriving. You have to look across the whole spectrum of what you do. And then you have to look at the spectrum of the world around you, because you can't operate inside of a bubble, right? That would be, then you wouldn't be serving your students or serving your community. So that's what creates all these layers of complexity, is it's not just internal to the institution, but, what are the workforce needs of your community? What's happening in 10 years down the road, let's look ahead and see where we're going. What influence will artificial intelligence have on all the work that we do? I mean, all of those things. So, we need to figure out how to be resilient, and being resilient really requires that you look comprehensively. I mean, you wouldn't think about your own health. You wouldn't look at your, gee, if I'm, if I can see well, which could be a challenge for me some days, if I can see well, both close and far, then everything is good in my whole entire body. It's not true. All the other pieces have to be good too. So,
Yeah, for sure. So I'm just curious on the transition to co-ed, was there a tipping point that you found that made you say, yeah, this is what we've got to do? Or again, was it a variety of information pieces that you were looking at? That is a big decision for a college to make.
It's so interesting that you would ask that question, because I absolutely had a tipping point. I think, I could talk about my tipping point and the tipping point perhaps for the community. But when I came to Wilson, I didn't have any preconceived notion about whether admission change was going to be part of the solution or not. But I did say to our community that I felt like everything should be on the table. And it's really back to what we've just been talking about, is looking comprehensively. That if we just look at programs, that's not going to be the solution. If we just look at could we have marketed better, that's not going to be the solution. We have to be able to look comprehensively, and the question of coeducation needs to be on the table. But the tipping point for me, so we had a whole long process that we went through to look at this. We had lots of different groups that looked at different aspects. We had a group that did look at coeducation, but a group that looked at programming and workforce and all sorts of things. Anyway, I was sitting one Saturday morning at an open house, a prospective student open house, and we had a panel of students, like you always do, talking about their experience at Wilson and the programs that they had signed on for. And what was so interesting to me is every student on that panel, every young woman on that panel said, I didn't come to Wilson because it was a women's college. I came for this program. I didn't come here because it was a women's college. I came here in spite of that, because I wanted to be in this program. And that, sitting there in the audience that day and we were probably, 8 months or so into this whole long commission process where we were looking at this change. That was the moment at which I knew that we would be okay if we made the transition to coeducation. And it was also the moment I realized that we would end up serving more women as a coeducational institution than as a single gender institution, because the young women on the panel who said, I came here despite the fact, led me to understand that the fact that we were limiting the gender of students coming into the institution was holding back students from enrolling in the institution. So I don't think that's said that at the time. I've said it, now, even now that I'm not there, that was not the one factor that made all of the difference. It was everything combined together. It was the additive nature of the work that we did that really made the difference.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, in your role at NAICU, you have the vantage point, the perspective to look across the entire nation at independent colleges and universities. And I'd love to know what trends, you've begun to talk a little bit about challenges. So I know debt is on your radar, but other challenges or trends that you see to be most pressing today, particularly for this sector in higher education, and any additional thoughts on what these institutions need to do to remain resilient?
Well, we are a very complicated nation, actually, because there's differences from one portion of the country to another portion of the country. So I think that one of the most important things is to know the world that you're situated in and to understand that world. I mean, if you're a regional college, if you're a national college, if you're an elite institution, everybody's got a different market that they're serving. And so to be clear about that market, I think is extraordinarily important and what that market needs. So if it makes sense to your market to offer a program that allows for free tuition under certain income levels, we've seen a great number of institutions do that, particularly in the last couple of years. So if you're under 80,000, if you're under 120,000, where, the institution that I spent a good number of years at, Carnegie Mellon, just went to a program under 200,000, recognizing the challenges around affordability, I think, are extraordinarily important for institutions today. And I think what you see happening in the marketplace is responding to that. Free programs are responding to some of those affordability challenges, but other institutions are responding to those in other ways. There are institutions looking at year-round programs. I just had a long conversation with somebody who's considering that last week. So 3-year programs, year-round programs. I think there's no limit to the creativity and the entrepreneurial spirit that leaders of institutions can bring to their institutions, if you're not afraid of change, right? So you have to be willing to I firmly believe that you can't solve a problem if you can't talk about the problem. So I think that's, I'll put that out there as being important to communities. So often, when we want to talk about consolidating programs or closing programs or recognizing that there's low enrollment in certain programs, they become these, off limits in some way. And I think that, and people feel that, they start to feel the pushback immediately about those things. And then if we don't want to deal with the noise around that, then we're not really serving the changes that are happening, because, if you're losing enrollment here and your enrollment is still strong, then you're obviously gaining enrollment somewhere else. And understanding that ebb and flow over time, I think, is really important. So I would say affordability would be at the top of my list. I think you've heard about that in this last presidential campaign cycle. Just the idea of student debt. I mean, we're sitting at $1.6 trillion in student debt, and that's despite the fact that during this last administration, during the Biden administration, they forgave a couple $100 million in student debt. So we're not moving that needle. We're going to need to do something different in order to move the needle on student debt. I think it's important that debt continue to be an option for students, because we don't want to preclude segments that might not be able to afford to pay for college in the moment and need the option of being able to take out debt. But I do believe that finding ways to take out a reasonable amount of debt, understanding how that's going to impact you, is going to be important. And certainly policymakers are seeing that too. And they're pushing bills and initiatives that are requiring things like demonstrating that there's financial value to programs. That's happening, not just in the independent sector, but it's happening across our ecosystem. So affordability, initiatives that recognize, particularly as we look at demographic changes, that we're going to have more students that are lower and middle income, and the affordability piece is just going to continue to be a challenge for them. From there, I think the piece about accountability is incredibly important today. Both policymakers and your general public, whether you want to call them consumers, or whether you want to call them students, or whether you want to call them families, parents, grandparents, everybody who gathers together to make an experience possible for students today, want some level of accountability. And I think we owe that to our community. I believe that we should be accountable. We are, it is a private good, what we do in the private sector, but it is a public service. And so with a public service, there is that responsibility toward people, and we need to make sure that they understand that we're being accountable. So, I think that we're going to have to find ways to be comfortable saying, this is what we're doing in career services. This is the number of jobs that students are getting when they leave our institution. This is the kind of jobs that students are getting when they leave our institution. It's fair to say that a good number of of parents and families want their students to get the education, and they want the skills and the knowledge that comes not just for that first job, but for the fifth job. Or the Department of Labor Statistics says you're going to have almost 12 jobs across your lifetime. So we want to be prepared for all of those. But at the same time, because of the cost today of a higher education, they also want to know, is the student that I'm helping be here, are they going to get a job when they get out of here? And we need to be able to respond to that. And, I guess I would say the third thing would be this piece about accessibility, just making sure that we are finding ways to bring new students into the higher education experience. So, 2/3 of our nation are not college graduates. And so we need to find ways that we can reach into different communities, new communities, and create the right kind of pathways for students to a 4-year degree. There are a lot of training programs. There are a lot of programs or certificate that will get students on a path. But is that path a sustainable path in the workforce today? And I think what we have to do is to find ways that we can meet students along that pathway. So if they've taken some certificates, or they've done other things, how can we help them get into the higher education network and to be able to access that degree in a reasonable amount of time, and with that kind of value, that kind of accountability that I was just talking about. So, we're going to have to take a look at these pieces. The investment by the federal government and the investment by state governments in higher education today is so great that we have to be accountable to the general public for the work that we do.
Those are all excellent, excellent points. I can see why you were selected for the role that you are in. So we have come to the end of our time. I have 2 final questions, and these questions come back to you and your leadership. So the first has to do with how you sustain your resilience and energy in the role. Are there some strategies or practices that you rely on to stay grounded as a leader?
For me, I need to keep growing. I need to keep learning new things. And I need to feel like I am finding that meaning, making a difference in my daily work. And if I feel like I'm making a difference, then the setbacks and the discouragements that come along the way, I don't take those personally. I do think that in order to be a leader today, and I will say this especially to women, is that you can't take the things that people say personally. So it's really interesting. I think we lean into these roles as people, as an individual person. But when you get in the role, you've taken on, it's kind of, it is, if you've gone through these inaugurations in higher education, they had this chain of office, right? And I think about that chain that hangs around your neck that represents your institution, that connects you to all of higher education. It's wonderful. But I think if it is an office. And so in many ways, when people are railing, they're railing against the position that you're in. And so often we take it personally, the whatever is being said on social media, or even being said directly to your face, or being said to your family. And I've had all of these experiences where people have said to my kids, your mom's wrecking this place. So you have to have a way to both help those that are around you, your family, your network that keeps you sane and strong, to be able to be a champion for you and to support you in the right way. You have to take care of them, as well as taking care of yourself, as well as taking care of your community. Being tough about it is really important today.
So here's the signature question for this season. So every interviewee is responding to this question, which is this: as a woman leading in higher education today, what do you believe is your most important contribution to the future of this sector, and how do you hope your leadership will inspire the next generation of women leaders?
That's a big question. And I think on a very tactical level, I think one of the things I'm really proud about is that we were able to start this whole initiative about doubling the Pell Grant. So, for lots and many years, for the last 50 years, everyone has worked at increasing the Pell Grant or seeing it be increased at the same level as inflation has, and it hasn't. So it's lost all of its purchasing power over time by not keeping track with inflation. So we were able to start a program that has now been embraced by our entire ecosystem, and we have a Student Aid Alliance that has 136 members in it, really looking at doubling the Pell Grant and having, kind of a bumper sticker, if you will, an initiative that is very directed and very specific. And it's just created a lot of support among communities. I know we're going to have ups and downs as we look at both the fiscal capability of our budgets in our nation, but I think that this whole idea of affordability is extraordinarily important. So anything that I can do, any contribution I can make to having this experience be more accessible and affordable to students, I do think makes a difference for our nation's students and for our economy over time, for our ability to be competitive as a nation. All of this is important and tied together. So that's the work that I'm excited about, in addition to all of the other pieces that we can do to create equity for the private nonprofit sector in the overall ecosystem. I think those are extremely important so that we continue to have the diversity in our ecosystem that we have. And I hope that, by doing this and by doing it in a way that is transparent and collaborative, that will encourage other women to embrace those pieces of their leadership style and be comfortable executing that for their communities and for our nation, and by serving on commissions and by saying yes. I guess that would be the thing, to say yes when you're asked to do something, and then to do your best in whatever it is that you're asked to do.
I know that you are already inspiring so many women and men and others as a result of the work that you have done and that you're doing. So, Barbara, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, with our listeners. And I wish you all the best as you continue the work that you're doing at NAICU.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here today, Melissa. I appreciate it.